All right, today we are going to go through different pieces of the last section of Tractate Sota. So we've been going through Sota over the last several months. Can't say we've gone through word for word, but different sections of the Gemara. And we're going to go through certain sections. This is what's called Agadita. Agadita means it's the non-legal discussion of the Gemara. So whenever the Gemara goes into stories, or as we're going to see today, not necessarily stories, but even messages. And the last section of Sota is actually rather harsh. Talks about the we call Yuridas Hadoros, the generations, the demise of the generations. That as time goes on, the different flaws that have creeped into society, especially after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Beis Hamikdash was not just a building, a temple. The Beis Hamikdash was an era of Kedusha. It was a location in which one was able to witness the presence of Hashem and to sense that holiness. And that sense of holiness changed the way people behaved. And so this Gemara, the last few daf over here, talks about the decline, the decline in the spirituality of society. So it's a rather depressing Gemara, I'll be honest, but we'll try to at least conclude on somewhat of a high note. And it's in the Gemara, so even the depressing parts of the Gemara we have to study, right? So let me share. The question is, what led the Gemara to this topic? Why is it that the Tractate Sota, how does it land over here, the topic of the decline of the generation? So let's take a step back and do very briefly the order of how this tractate spelled out. So the Tractate Sota is about the story of the Sota. The Sota is the suspected woman who there's no proof of adultery, but there's suspicion of adultery, and there's a very unique process where the husband and wife go up to the temple, and they are meant to. The Kohen reads a certain portion of the Torah to her, and then there's this unique water which is brought out, and there's the letters on the parchment, including the name of God, are scratched off of the parchment into the water. It's again one of the very fascinating mitzvahs in Torah. And then she drinks the water. And then, if she was righteous, then the water is harmless. In fact, it becomes water of blessing. But if she had in fact sinned, then the water becomes a poison for her. Not only for her, but for the man she sinned with. Very good. As long as the husband himself was of high moral standing, faithful. So that led to the discussion of. So that's the Tractate Sota. That segued into a discussion of what language certain prayers or statements have to be said in. Once we mentioned the Kohanim speaking in a certain language, it led us to a discussion of other areas in Torah in which something has to be recited, and does it have to be recited in Hebrew, or could it be recited in any language? And as we said, the prayer can be done in any language. The Shema can be done in any language. The Sota, not mistaken, that has to be in Hebrew, and the Brechas Kohanim has to be in Hebrew. And then another thing that has to be done in Hebrew is the words for the Egla Arufa, which is which we spoke about more recently. That if someone is found, if a body is found, and nobody knows how this person was killed, so it says the elders of the nearest city have to come, and they have to make a statement over the body saying we weren't directly involved in this person's death. Fine. So the discussion Gemara says that statement have to be said in Hebrew or not. So that's how we got to that point. Then he's not. Then this whole thing doesn't happen. You can tell if a person was choked. It looks like someone who was chenek, someone who was choked to death. So it's clearly a murder. And I mean, if you think about it, just how fascinating that is. That today, from time to time, you hear about a body that's pulled up somewhere or found somewhere, and other than just a casual, oh, that's interesting, or how tragic, we just move on with our day, right? And the Torah says that if a body is found, the whole city has to pause and ask themselves, were we somewhat involved in this? Did our actions or did our inactions in any way contribute to this person's death? It just tells you, again, sometimes these mitzvahs, even if they seem to be unlikely to happen, even if a mitzvah is unlikely to happen, the lesson is certainly relevant. And I think the lesson of the Egla Arufa, the fact that the whole city has to stop and the elders of the city have to go out to that body and make a declaration that we were not involved. When this person came to our city, we fed him and we helped walk him out of town. It just tells you how the Torah views responsibility for other people. If there's a tragedy in your town, you have to ask yourself, did I in any way contribute to this in some way? Maybe not by a direct action, but by indirect action. Maybe it's not by something I said, but by something I didn't say. This person passed me in the street, and I could have said something nice, and I could have asked them how they're doing, and I didn't. A tragedy that happens in your town is something you have to, at the very least, stop and ask yourself, do I share some responsibility for what took place?
Say the person must have been in the town.
No, we don't know that. We don't know where this person was. We just assume that we take the people from the closest town. We say the closest town is the most likely location where he came from. And in fact, that's what they say. Say, no, we don't know. As far as we know, he was not here. As far as we know, he did not come to our town and ask for food and was denied. It's a mitzvah which is unlikely to happen. Obviously, it's not a mitzvah which is practically observed today. But the message of the mitzvah is extremely practical. It's how we see ourselves in the context of the of our surroundings and our environment. Now, this leads to the topic which the tractate concludes with, which is the decline of the generations. Why? Because the Gemara over here says, and the Mishnah that is, that at a certain point they stopped this mitzvah. The Gemara says, the Mishnah that it says, bottom of 47a in Tractate Sota. No, I don't think so. I don't think it's a chok. Misharabu hamenafim, when the number of adulterers increased, when adultery increased among the Jewish people, Pasku Mayim Hamarim, they stopped doing the whole process of the sota, which is the bitter waters. She would drink the bitter waters. They stopped it once it became apparent that there was a lot of adulterers among the Jewish people. Why? I think second Beis Hamikdash. Why? Why would they pause the mitzvah? The reason is because, as was mentioned earlier, the only time the bitter waters, which is clearly a miraculous potion, there's no logic to it, there's no science to this spiritual, to the waters being either poisonous or blessing. It's purely a divine, I remember share a story. There's a story in my family. It's talking about miraculous, sometimes, in other words, I guess the backdrop to the story is this. If God wanted that this woman should be punished for her behavior, so I'm just punishing her for her behavior. Why need the water? It doesn't really make sense. That's not, there's no science to the water causing the illness. And the answer is that sometimes God says, yes, there's going to be a divine action, but it's going to have to come through the vessels of reality. It's going to have some sort of vessel within reality which carries out the divine will. And therefore there needs to be water. Granted, it doesn't make sense that this water should cause any sort of harm or this water should cause blessing. It's clearly the act of the hand of God, but there needs to be some sort of physical manifestation of the hand of God. So there's a story that's shared. It goes back it's actually a family story from my wife's side. And the story is told about Kusha Dokshitzer, which is that Kusha, or his name was Yekusiel, was a chassid, and he lived in the Russian city of Dokshitz. And he says like this, he said he was sick. And he once went to his Rebbe who was the 5th Chabad Rebbe, known as the Rebbe Rashab, and he said, I'm sick, what do I do? So the Rebbe said to him, go to, I think his name was Shmotkin the Aptaker. Go to, his eyes were ill. His illness was in his eyes. He said, go to the Aptaker, which is the optometrist, and ask him to give you the yellow medication. Fine. So he goes to the optometrist. He says, I went to the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, and I told him I have a problem with the eyes. He sent me to you. And he said, give me the yellow medication. So the optometrist said, look, I have a cream. I don't have a yellow cream right now. Maybe other times I have it. Right now, I have a regular cream. It's not a yellow cream, but take this, see if it works. So he took it home, put it on, and it didn't work. So he went back a few weeks later to the optometrist, who's also a chassid, and he said, I need the yellow medication. So he said, what can I tell you? I don't have any yellow medication. I just have this regular cream, which works, generally speaking. That's all I have. So he said to him, what's the problem? Take your cream, add a little bit of yellow food coloring, and it'll be yellow. And then it'll solve the problem. The Rebbe said, give me the yellow medication. All right, it just needs to be yellow. So take your regular medication and make, or as my father-in-law shared the story, macheskel, just make it yellow. What's the big deal? The Rebbe said a yellow medication, make your regular medication, make it yellow. And he gave him the medication, he added the food coloring, so it became yellow, and sure enough, the medication worked. So sometimes there is the clearly a higher power which is causing things to happen, but it needs to happen through the vessels of reality. So to over here, the water of the sota was clearly a power, a divine power, but it happened through this water. But why would they pause this mitzvah? The reason is this, as was mentioned earlier, I think Steve, you said this, is that the only way the sota waters worked was if the husband was innocent. But if the husband himself was guilty of infidelity, then the sota waters wouldn't work. So therefore, the husband rings his wife. He says, I suspect my wife of being of adultery. So the Kohen says, okay, let's do the process. We'll scrape off the ink. But if the husband was himself an adulterer, so then it wouldn't work. So the Gemara is saying that once they realize we live in a generation, unfortunately, where adultery is very common, so that all that's happening over here is the name of God is being erased in vain. The name of God is very powerful. And generally speaking, erasing God's name is a very severe violation of Torah. The Torah permitted it over here to bring peace between a husband and wife. But what happening was the name was erased, and she would drink the water and she would be fine. But that wasn't really an indication of innocence. It could as much be an indication that the husband was just as guilty as the wife was. So he basically realized that God's name was being erased, and the waters weren't actually clarifying anything, because it could very well be that she sinned, but he did as well, and that's why it's not working. So therefore they canceled, and they no longer did the Mayim Hamorim.
A simpler idea, solution, that if the husband knows already it doesn't work, and he knows that he did something, so he just doesn't go.
Maybe he didn't realize, that the fact that the water doesn't work for someone who sinned is not directly in the Torah. It doesn't say that the Torah. The sages said, what's that? Maybe, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe they felt that the water somehow, maybe there was other people who were suspicious. Maybe they felt this would be, maybe the husband really knew, but he felt other people were suspicious. I don't know. But the point is they felt that the water is being, because there was so much immorality, they felt it's not the mitzvah. All that's happening right now is God's name is being erased, and there's no real solutions. There's no real clarification of righteousness based on the waters. Fine. Furthermore, Misha Rabu Haroitzchin, once there were the numbers of murderers increased, they removed the process of the Egla Arufa, which we just said. They stopped doing the Egla Arufa once there were many murderers as well. Okay, I want to jump a little bit now to go to the Gemara's discussion. Let's jump to the discussion of the downfall of the generation. And what's interesting about this Gemara, which is on 47b of Sota, again, it is a little bit depressing because the Gemara talks about how we've gotten progressively worse. But I think what is more fascinating about this Gemara is the Gemara describing what leads to what. When we think of negative behavior, often we think about how did we get here, right? When someone does something wrong, or perhaps on a personal level. We're in a month of tshuva. Maybe this is coming to mind now. Maybe this is what's relevant about it. We're in a month of El, which is a month of personal reflection. And sometimes we may ask ourselves, I've done something wrong, but how did I get here? And sometimes it's not important just to know the problem as it is now, but to understand what led me down this path. And if I know what led me down this path, right, if I just treat the symptom, then I'm not really going to address the problem. If I just treat the symptom again and again, I'm not going to cure the underlying issue. As you can see, what the Gemara over here points out is the cause and effect. What starts down what we call a slippery slope? What leads to what? So we could look at it from the lens of history and say, all right, this is how historically things went from bad to worse. Or we can look at it in a very personal way and say, what is it that perhaps if I see some of my behavior within this behavior, and I can understand where certain negative behavior comes from and how I get to that point. Okay, so with that, let's jump into the Gemara and see what the Gemara has to say on this topic. Says, yeah.
If, let's say today, we live in a certain community, that there is no Hashem idolatry, and there is no murder, we can do the Eglah Rufa.
No, the Eglah Rufa is dependent. All right, just to repeat the question. Can you do Eglah Rufa in a city where there's no adultery, where there's no murder? Eglah Rufa is only connected to murder.
Right, I'm saying,
so, so at a simple level, the Eglah Rufa required the Beis Din Hagadol in Yerushalayim. The Eglah Rufa required the what we call the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, which no longer exists. So that's at least one reason why it's not done. There may be other reasons, but for sure that's one reason why it would not be done. It starts with, again, the Eglah Rufa, when that body is found, the first representatives that come are from the Supreme Court in Jerusalem. They come and then they measure to the nearest city. Once they determine where the nearest city is, then they go to the elders of that city and they say, you have to show up now to this dead body. But it starts with the Beis Din Hagadol. So anything which has to do with the Beis Din Hagadol, with the great Beis in Jerusalem, is no longer practiced.
Possible to find a dead body that nobody knows anything about today.
Are you saying nowadays we just know so much more?
Yeah.
But is that true though? Do we really not know? I mean, I've heard that as much with. I understand. But with all the information we have, apparently there's still a lot of unsolved murders and things like that. I don't know. All right. It could be that it's less likely now than it used to be. That's true. Right. And there's DNA.
Everybody knows where I was at. I was not involved in this.
Right.
This is a fundamental legal aspect
right.
that is addressed here in this part of it.
Right. You're saying that today we know everyone. There's much greater knowledge. There's the eyes that are watching us.
Fundamentally, they're answering the base question.
Right.
In
Uh-huh.
40 or 50 years old.
What's that?
They're solving murders 40 years
Oh,
old.
right. That's, by the way, your point actually is interesting. That's a part of the Gemara I didn't even get to, which is you're saying they solve murders 40, 50 years old. So the question is, what if witnesses, the Gemara addresses that to some degree, which says, what if once the basin is there and they're doing this whole process, suddenly two witnesses show up and say, oh, we know who carried out this murder. So if it's in the middle of the process, the question is, do you complete the process? Because the completion of the process is the killing of the animal, becomes a sacrifice. What if witnesses show up? So it depends when the witnesses show up. So this idea that even the Gemara recognizes the possibility that you could have a unknown murder which suddenly becomes known. All right, okay, now we're jumping to another area. Fine. So now the Gemara says, the Gemara goes through a list of what leads to what in a negative sense. Fine. Says the Gemara, Misherabu bale hana'am nisavsu hadinin. When the number of Torah scholars who were pleasure seekers increased, justice was perverted. So the increase in pursuit of pleasure corrupts justice. I feel kind of guilty saying this because I just spent half my week on vacation. So this is a case in point, right? But
That's what you did.
how does the pursuit of pleasure, by the way, it doesn't even say, we're not even talking about forbidden pleasure, we're talking about pleasure. Unrelated to this, we have a steak and scotch event this coming Wednesday night. But the point is, the pursuit of pleasure. How does the pursuit of pleasure lead to corruption of justice? All right. So what is it? So let's first explain it. Then we'll explain it. What are how do you understand it? V'niskalkalu hamaisim, and actions were distorted. So let me share the commentary on this. What's the logic? What's the connection? Again, the idea of cause and effect. How does this lead to that? So the answer is this. Rashi says, Nisavsu hadinim. Rashi says, people who pursue just pleasure, ein matrichim atzmon la'ayin bidin. It leads to an attitude of laziness. You're pursuing pleasure. For a judge to be just, they have to work really hard to come to a clear understanding of the case and a resolution of the case. And when a person is a pleasure seeker, means pleasure-seeking people, if you're living a life of pleasure-seeking, then you'll take shortcuts because I don't want to work hard. A lazy approach. Laziness, injustice leads to corruption. We're not even talking about wickedness. We're not even talking about intentional corruption. It's unintentional corruption. And that is that a pleasure-seeking approach to life leads a person not to work hard. And if you're not going to work hard in justice, you're not going to reach the just and honest conclusion and resolution of issues. And that's why once there was the pursuit of pleasure, justice was corrupted, and a person's the deeds were decisions were, as he points out over here. I read the Hebrew of Rashi. In the English over here, he says, as Torah scholars became concerned with ease and comfort, they did not invest the time and effort necessary to properly analyze the court cases and questions of halacha that were brought before them. As a result, the decisions they issued were often poorly thought out and incorrect. Thus, justice was perverted, and the deeds of the public who relied on their halachic rulings suffered. Interestingly, in the Pirkei Avos, chapter 6 of Pirkei Avos talks all about Torah study. And one of the Mishnahs, see if I have it in front of me. Yeah. One of the Mishnahs in Pirkei Avos, chapter 6, says as follows. Chapter 6, Halat Mishnah Daled, which says, Kachi darka shel Torah. This is the way of Torah. Pas b'melach tochel. Bread and salt you shall eat. Umayim b'msura tishta. And simple water you should drink. V'al ha'aretz tishon. And on the ground you should sleep. V'chai yitza'ar tichya. And a life of, literally means pain. Life of pain you should live. Uba Torah ata amel. And in Torah you should toil. If you do so, praise be are you. So, how do you understand that Mishnah? The way of Torah is eat bread and salt, drink a little bit of water, sleep on the ground. What if a person has the means to eat and drink comfortably? Am I supposed to? Torah doesn't believe in what's the word in which we pain ourselves? There's a proper word for that. The word in the Torah, what's that? Self-affliction, right? That's not generally a way of Torah to afflict oneself with pain. So, in fact, the Torah forbids certain forms of self-affliction. You're not allowed to scratch here. The Torah talks about not allowed to cause scratches to yourself in mourning. So, how do we reconcile the Torah that the Torah generally does not support self-affliction with this mission? Pirkei Avos says, you want to know the way of Torah? Iskafia holding. So you're saying it's a Chassidic idea of holding back. Okay, what's the value of Iskafia? Holding back from pleasure.
It's not literal. It's probably like in those what Rashi say
To you, I'm Meilim Batorah. I understand, but the Mishnah, the Pirkei Avos generally is pretty literal. It's not a, and it's saying it's spelling out you should eat, and you should eat just bread and water, bread and salt, water, sleep. I feel bad, Azan, because we have a caterer here, so I don't want to take away any business. So one way of understanding it is that even if all you have is bread and water, and even if all you have is just the ground to sleep on, still you should study Torah. That even if that's what you have, still you should study Torah. But another way is, I think, connecting to the value of what's being said over here, is that when you pursue a life of pleasure, you become lazy in the true toil of Torah. And that, it could be someone who is now obviously the standards of life 2,000 years ago in the time of the Mishnah, the standard of life now is very different. Therefore, you can't compare what would be considered to be uncomfortable then was what's uncomfortable now. Today, what is uncomfortable nowadays? When my internet connection is bad. That's the definition of discomfort nowadays. The old days, discomfort meant you were cold. You didn't have it was today we have a whole different understanding of discomfort. But the point is, the common denominator is that to be comfortable in the discomfort is good because it allows you to toil. You work harder. When you become too comfortable, you become too dependent on the luxuries of life. That you have to have this luxury, you have to have your frappuccino in the morning, and you have to have your, you have to have all the exact flavors and everything, and you need to have your very comfortable bed with your, what are the fancy new mattresses, you become too comfortable, it takes away the hard work which is necessary to truly tap into the wisdom of Torah. And that's, I think, the meaning of the Gemara. And everyone on their level could say, I could be a little bit uncomfortable. Uncomfortability could be, by the way, that I'm hungry right now. But instead of, even though I can finish, I'm an adult, so I can stop my Torah study whenever I want. So I'm hungry right now, I can close the book and go grab something to eat. Or I could say, you know what? It's all right that I'm hungry. It's okay that I'm uncomfortable. I'm studying Torah, and it's okay to toil in it because it's valuable, and I'll work on it. And if I'm a little bit uncomfortable, that's not only okay, maybe that's truly the key to getting to Torah study. So that's what I maybe I'm going off a little bit, but I think the point over here he's saying is that when the sages became Balei Hana, when the sages became pleasure seekers, that corrupted Torah study. Yeah. Okay, good. So your person has to be honest with themselves. A person has to be honest with themselves, to your point, as Roman was saying. So what about if your hunger interferes with your Torah study? You're right. In that situation, then it's better to pause so you can study properly. But maybe we have to train ourselves. You speak to people who went through, severe, difficult training in the military, right? As somebody who knows, who went through, a friend of mine who was in the, what is it called? He was a Navy SEAL. And then in the Navy SEALs, there's something called, I think it's called Hell Week, right? And there's serious discomfort, and there's no comfortability. There's a part of the training, because if what you're doing is intense and is real and really, and you feel, your job is critical, so then you got to be comfortable. You got to become accustomed to doing so, even in a state of discomfort. And so, therefore, the ramifications of this one line of the Gemara, I think, are very significant. Is that it's difficult to be in a world, and what makes us challenging, is we live in a world in which pleasure is more accessible than ever, more than ever today. At the click of the button, we have so much. We live in a world of instant gratification. Again, I'm not even talking about that which is forbidden. We're not going. That's a separate discussion. But just the fact that we live in a world where there's instant gratification, so we can become very comfortable in the pursuit of pleasure. The Gemara says the pursuit of pleasure corrupts justice. It corrupts our ability to study Torah properly. Fine. Next. Spent some time on that. The Gemara continues. Misharabu ro'e panibadin. So the first, it talked about perhaps an unintentional corruption of justice. Now it moves on to what is more corrupt in justice, which is Misharabu ro'e panibadin. When the number of judges who displayed favoritism in judgment increased, which is clearly a Torah violation and obviously a corruption of justice. When that happened, batal lo saguru, the commandment of one of the prohibitions for a judge is a whole set of mitzvahs connected to a judge. And one of the mitzvahs of a judge is lo saguru mipnei ish. It is forbidden for a judge to be afraid of a human being. The judge has to be fearless. As soon as the judge is afraid of human beings, again, there goes justice. So one thing lets the other. When judges began to allow or display favoritism in judgment, the commandment of you shall not be afraid of people ceased to be practiced, as well as another prohibition of lo takiru, do not show any recognition of the litigants in front of you. Uparku al shamayim, and people removed the yoke of heaven, v'nasnu alehem ol basar v'dam, and instead of having the yoke of heaven, they placed upon themselves the yoke of human beings. Which, as he's explained, according to, in other words, they stopped being concerned about fearful of heaven, and instead they were fearful of human beings, which, according to Meiri, actually refers to something very specific. It may sound like a general statement. They stopped being fearful of heaven, and instead they were fearful of human beings. Meiri says this is talking about that a Jew should bring, if they have a problem with a fellow Jew, they are required to bring it to a Jewish court. That's the halacha. If you have a problem with a fellow Jew, you have to bring it to the Jewish court. The problem is that in that generation where the courts were corrupt, they stopped bringing their cases to Jewish courts, and they started bringing it to the secular courts, which is a Torah violation. And because that starts with the fact that the Jewish courts were corrupt. Fine. When the Gemara continues, Misharabu achre bitzam libam holech, when the number of people increased about whom the Torah says their hearts lust for gain. In other words, people seeking physical gratification. Rabim ha'omrim l'ra toiv v'la toivra. These are all quotes. This is a quote from, excuse me. Rabim ha'omrim l'ra toiv v'la toivra. It was from the book of Yeshaya. There's a pasuk in Yeshaya, Isaiah, where he rebukes. He says, those who say regarding evil, it is good, and regarding good, it is evil. In other words, what is worse than good and bad? What is worse than there being evil in a society, or there being evil in a country or in a family? What's worse than there being evil? I think evil would be the worst thing. What's worse than there being evil is referring to evil as good. When we applaud evil, that's what's worse. When we turn bad into good, and we turn good into bad, the best is that there should be good and there should be bad. And the best is that people behave properly. Beneath that is when people behave improperly. Worse than that is when we start applauding improper behavior. We start saying improper behavior, Lara, and we call it good. And Yeshaya says there will come a time where people not only will do things wrong, but we will refer to the wrongdoers as good. And the righteous people will refer to as negative. As he says, what does he say over here? In other words, what does this have to do with the previous thing? The previous statement was when we began pursuing physical gratification, that led to this reality. In other words, a world which becomes consumed with physical success loses its barometer of right and wrong. Because who do we value in a world? One of the when we take these ideas and apply it to modern days, you can see the application of this. And that is that who do we applaud in this world? In a world in which we are applauding the Hollywood stars. What's that? Right. When I say we, I mean as a society. You're right. Who's we? But a society which applauds the celebrities and Hollywood performers who are very often portraying unethical and immoral ideas. So then we're in direct fulfillment of this verse. which is, again, that we begin to, and we become consumed with physical pursuits, with animalistic pursuits, with the bodily images. So then what happens is we begin to applaud and to value the people who, I'm not saying are evil, but certainly shouldn't be the people we respect. And those who should be respected, those people who are here to share messages of true virtue and commitment to Hashem and righteousness, those people are disrespected. So this is what the Gemara says. This happened already. The Gemara says back in the times of the Gemara. Misharabu hayihirim, when the number of arrogant people increased, Hischilu benos Yisrael lihinasi liyihirim. The following Gemara is very interesting. Again, this is somewhat of a depressing Gemara, but it's an enlightening Gemara. Misharabu hayihirim, when the arrogant people increased, when arrogance became more acceptable, I guess. So it says the women began to marry and pursue arrogant people. In other words, arrogance is a critical flaw according to Torah. But again, arrogance became common. People would look down at others. It almost became a quality. And women looked for that to marry. Why? And then it says, She'ein doreinu ro'eh el lapanim. Because our generation, says the Gemara, the Gemara is saying our generation, which is, 1600 years ago, at least, sees only the surface and is easily fooled by appearance on the surface. So now the Gemara challenges that. Gemara says, how could it be that you're saying that people became more arrogant and then women actually pursued arrogant men to marry them? Eini, is that really so? Well, we find the statement from the Talmud which says, Haiman dimiyaher, when a person is arrogant, afilu inshe beise lo mikabel. This person is not accepted even by the people in their own home. Arrogance becomes rejected even by their own family members. An arrogant person is not just rejected by society. An arrogant person is rejected by their family members. So how do you reconcile that with what the Gemara says, that the women were marrying and pursuing arrogant men? So the Gemara answers, very simple. Me'ikara kaftzale. Initially, women were drawn to the arrogance of these people. Initially, they can be drawn to it. L'saif mitzal alayhu. But in the end, it takes only a short amount of time for a person to realize how difficult it is to be married to someone who is arrogant. So arrogance could be misleading, and in fact could be attractive at first glance. But ultimately, to live with someone who is arrogant, that's where the sex. So both parts of the Talmud are true. They were drawn to it, but then they were repulsed by it, because arrogance is something which, over the course of time, becomes more repulsive to those who are close to it. I'm going to jump a few pages now, because to get to the text that I shared in the text promoting tonight's class, and that is, I mentioned about chutzpah. What about chutzpah? So the Gemara says, Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis 49b, which is the last daf of Gemara Sota. The Gemara says like this: Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol Omer. Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol would say, Miyom shechara Beis Hamikdash, from the day the temple was destroyed. He basically says every level of scholarship was diminished to the level beneath it. Chakimaya lamevika safraya. The great scholars became like the school teachers, which is a level beneath them. Safraya kechazanaya. The school teachers became like the attendants. Chazanaya ka'amada ara. And the attendants became like the unlearned commoners. Amada ara, Azla, the Daldala, and the common person became steadily more deficient in wisdom and in observance. People don't even search for wisdom anymore. Used to be, you search for wisdom. Now people aren't even searching for it. On whom can we rely on? Only on our Father in heaven. And here's where the Gemara says the very fascinating statement, which is, Be'ikvos Mashiach. At the final days before Mashiach comes, Chutzpah Yaske. There will be a lot of chutzpah in the world. So if you look around the world and you see a lot of chutzpah, The Gemara says maybe that's a sign of the coming of Mashiach. What is the definition of chutzpah that the Gemara describes over here? The government will turn to heresy, and there shall be no rebuke. I know everyone's beginning to think of their political opinions and who this applies to, who this doesn't apply to. The government shall turn to heresy, and nobody will be able to rebuke them. Beis va'ad yil is nus. The meeting place for the sages will be used for harlotry, znus, adultery, which, according to one understanding of it, which is interesting. What does that mean? What does it mean that the yeshiva halls will become places of harlotry? So I saw two understandings of the statement. One is that in the previously, the yeshiva halls were in the outskirts of the city. And when the yeshiva halls stopped functioning as yeshiva halls, so buildings in the outskirts of the city become an easy destination for those who are troublemakers, those who are looking for inappropriate behavior. But another explanation of this Gemara, another reading of this Gemara is that, see this over here. Another reading of the Gemara is that there will be meeting places for harlotry. In other words, people will be so they'll have such chutzpah that they will openly designate places for immorality. So the fact that there is, sin, again, what this goes back to is a similar idea earlier. The fact that there is sin always existed, right? From the very beginning of time. Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, they sinned. The question is the acceptance of sin. The acceptance is the applause of corruption. That's really what the Gemara is getting to. Is that it's one thing, there's always, since the beginning of time, there's been good and there's been evil. There's the Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Tov, and the Yetzer Hara. The good inclination and the evil inclination. The question is, the first critical step is to always recognize what evil is. When you see sin, identify it both, and it's easy to look out in society, and throughout this Gemara, it's very easy to look at society and say, oh, for sure, society has these problems. All these issues in the Gemara, you can see it if you just look around you. The bigger question is look inside you. And the question is, do you identify negative behavior within yourself? The starting point to solving negative behavior, the starting point to doing tshuva and to correcting behavior is to identify it. If you don't identify it, both in society as well as in yourself, you're never going to solve it. And so therefore he's saying over here, one of the steps of exile is that there was meeting, that they designated places for immorality. Immorality always existed, but it used to be something which was hidden. It used to be that those who committed it were embarrassed, and society was embarrassed if of those types of sins. But now, says the Gemara, now meaning 1,500 years ago, they already were so that the chutzpah is, what is chutzpah? Chutzpah is not just doing something wrong, but proudly doing something wrong. That's really what the definition of chutzpah is. That's the difference between chutzpah and sin. Sin is that I may have done something wrong. We all do things wrong, but I'm quiet about it. I'm embarrassed about it. If someone does something wrong and then is proud of it or is not ashamed of it, that's chutzpah. That's chutzpah. I mean, whatever, the word chutzpah is broadly used, but that's, I think, the Talmudic definition of chutzpah is the lack of shame in that which is done wrong, both as a society as an individual. I just want to conclude, it's 9 o'clock, I want to conclude, it's been a pretty depressing Gemara, talking about all the problems of society. So are we supposed to walk away from this just being depressed? So I'll share two final positive points to end it. One is, the Gemara says that this is ikvus of the Mashiach. That the right before Mashiach comes there's going to be this widespread corruption, it's widespread chutzpah. So when I look around the world and I see chutzpah and I see corruption, so I mean, of course, we're supposed to do whatever we can to solve problems. But part of the message goes to me, maybe this is just the last dark moment before the light of Mashiach, the light of redemption. But secondly, and this is something I think the Rebbe focused on, is that if during the era before the oncoming of Mashiach there exists chutzpah in a negative way, then everything that exists in the negative exists in the positive. There's a balance, right? There's a positive, there's a balance of positive and negative. And just like chutzpah exists in the negative realm, there exists also the positive chutzpah. And positive chutzpah means to be audacious, to be able to publicly, proudly, just negative chutzpah means the pride in sin. The positive chutzpah is the pride in mitzvahs. His ability, and that's what the whole Mahalach, the whole approach the Rebbe took, where you can go to a public location and light a menorah publicly, or go out on the street and ask someone to do a mitzvah and wrap tefillin. takes chutzpah, but positive chutzpah. Anything that exists in a negative sense has its balance in the positive world. And if chutzpah exists in a negative world, in a negative way, chutzpah must exist in a positive way. And there was no leader who pushed more of that than the Rebbe, saying, wherever you are, don't be ashamed. Be proud of who you are, proud of Torah, proud of your mitzvahs, proud of your yarmulke, proud of your tzitzis, and have that chutzpah, that Jewish chutzpah, or the Gaon Yaakov. You could say, you could call it real Jewish pride, and don't be ashamed of the Torah and the mitzvahs that you carry around proudly. So that's the positive chutzpah that will exist to counteract the negative chutzpah that exists in the world nowadays. All right. Thank you all for joining. We'll daven Ma'ariv, and then all are invited to join us downstairs.